Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. When I listened to Donald Trump declare a national emergency at the U.S.-Mexico border, I was struck not only by the intensity of his language, but by the profound contradiction at its core. Here was the president of a nation built, enriched, and sustained by immigrants, framing migration, especially from Mexico and Latin America, as an existential threat. As someone who has spent decades studying global development, demographics, and the political economy of the United States, I could not help but see this speech not as a response to reality, but as a performance, a carefully staged spectacle aimed at reshaping public emotion rather than public understanding. Trump's rhetoric is constructed around fear, an invasion, criminality, drugs, chaos spilling across the border, but these depictions collapse under even minimal scrutiny. Crime rates among immigrants are lower than among U.S.-born citizens. The majority of drugs entering the U.S. come through official ports of entry, not through migrants crossing on foot. The surge of migrants is driven by forces like violence, climate, stress, and economic instability conditions, often worsened by U.S. policies in the region. And yet, Trump frames migration as catastrophe. Why? Because fear mobilizes, fear organizes, fear delivers political loyalty. Declaring a national emergency allows him to transform a complex socioeconomic phenomenon into a moral drama. Us versus them, the righteous nation versus the threatening outsider. But this narrative is not merely inaccurate, it is historically incoherent. The United States exists because immigration shaped every dimension of its national life. Migrants built the physical infrastructure of the nation, fueled its agricultural revolution, powered its industrial expansion, and drove its technological innovation. Even today, immigrants sustain U.S. demographic growth. At a time when the native-born population is aging rapidly, they start businesses at higher rates than U.S.-born citizens. They contribute massively to Social Security and Medicare. They are the backbone of agriculture, construction, caregiving, and logistics. Without immigrant labor, including Mexican and Central American labor, entire sectors of the U.S. economy would collapse. So the paradox is unmistakable. A country dependent on migrants politically demonizes them. And Trump has turned that paradox into a movement. He uses migration not as a policy challenge, but as an identity battlefield. He taps into deeper anxieties about race, culture, and national decline, not because migrants cause these anxieties, but because they are a visible target upon whom fear can be projected. In that sense, Trump's border emergency is less about the border and more about the nation's unresolved internal crisis, the fear of demographic change, the unresolved wounds of inequality, and the erosion of social trust. Trump amplifies these anxieties and channels them toward the border, offering a wall as symbolic protection against forces that are, in truth, internal, systemic, and decades in the making. The real emergency, as I see it, lies not at the border, but in the politics of fear that now governs American discourse. When I analyze the U.S. economy through a historical and structural lens, the first truth that becomes impossible to ignore is this: immigrants have been and remain one of America's greatest economic assets. This is not an ideological statement or a moral argument. It is an empirical fact borne out by decades of economic research, demographic data, and industrial evolution. And yet, astonishingly, this reality is precisely what Trump denies in his border rhetoric. Let me begin with the fundamentals. The United States is aging. The native-born fertility rate has fallen below replacement level. Without immigration, the American workforce would shrink sharply, undermining the tax base that supports Social Security, Medicare, and public services. Immigrants, especially from Mexico and Latin America, have offset this demographic decline for decades. They fill essential roles in construction, food production, logistics, hospitality, and caregiving. They literally make the American economy run. Consider agriculture. Up to half of all farm workers in the U.S. are immigrants, many of them Mexican. Without their labor, crops would rot in the fields, food prices would skyrocket, and U.S. food security would be severely compromised. In construction, immigrants account for roughly 30% of the workforce, building the homes, roads, and infrastructure Americans rely on. In elder care and child care, two sectors facing profound shortages, immigrants fill critical gaps. Their contribution is not peripheral, it is foundational. Immigrants also power entrepreneurship. They start businesses at significantly higher rates than native-born Americans. From small restaurants and construction firms to major tech startups, immigrant-driven enterprises create millions of jobs. The economic dynamism celebrated as American innovation is in many ways a migrant story, and yet Trump recasts these workers not as contributors but as outsiders and threats. He constructs a narrative in which immigrants supposedly take jobs, drain welfare, or undercut wages. But every serious study shows the opposite. Immigrants complement rather than replace native-born workers. They occupy different labor market segments, frequently doing jobs that citizens will not do at existing wages. Their presence allows American businesses to remain competitive, prices to remain stable, and domestic workers to move into higher skilled roles. So why does Trump ignore this economic reality? Because acknowledging it undermines the political utility of his immigration narrative. If immigrants are essential, then the crisis dissolves, fear loses its potency, and the border loses its symbolic value as a battlefield. Trump needs the border to be a stage on which he performs national rebirth through exclusion. But there is a deeper layer here. Anti-immigrant sentiment becomes a way to avoid confronting structural problems that truly harm American workers. Wage stagnation, deindustrialization, monopolistic corporate power, and tax policies favoring the wealthy have eroded living standards for decades. These are the forces hollowing out the American middle class, not immigrants. Yet blaming migrants is far easier than confronting systemic inequality. Thus, when Trump demonizes Mexican and Latin American migrants specifically, he is tapping into old racial and cultural hierarchies while diverting attention from policy failures at home. In reality, these migrants are not America's burden. They are among its greatest sources of vitality and resilience. The tragedy is that the politics of fear obscures this truth. When I reflect on why Mexican and Latin American immigrants have become the focal point of Trump's nationalist project, I must turn from economics to something deeper and more volatile, the politics of identity and the construction of fear. Here, we move beyond wages, labor markets, and demographic change, we enter the terrain of race, cultural anxiety, and the long psychological history of the U.S.-Mexico border. And it is in this terrain that Trump's message gains its emotional force. The border has never been a purely geographic line. It is a symbolic boundary that has been racialized for more than a century. In American political imagination, the border often represents the dividing line between order and chaos, civilization and danger, us and them. Trump did not create this narrative. He inherited it, but he elevated it to a central pillar of his political identity and transformed it into a mass emotional project. Mexican and Central American migrants have long been portrayed through crude stereotypes. Criminals, gang members, drug traffickers, job thieves. None of this aligns with actual data, which consistently show that immigrants commit fewer crimes than U.S.-born citizens. But political narratives are not built on data. They are built on imagery, repetition, and emotional triggers. Trump understood this intuitively. He understood that fear of the other is one of the oldest tools of political mobilization. Part of this fear emerges from the reality of demographic change. The United States is moving toward a majority-minority population. For many white Americans, especially older, rural, or economically insecure groups, this transition triggers anxiety about cultural displacement. Trump tapped into this deep unease and transformed it into a sense of collective grievance. Build the wall was not just a policy demand, it was a cultural rallying cry. It promised the defense of an identity imagined as threatened. But another layer of fear runs through economic insecurity. For decades, communities across the Midwest and South have been hollowed out by deindustrialization, outsourcing, automation, and the relentless concentration of wealth. Rather than confront the corporations and policymakers responsible for these structural changes, politicians have found it easier to redirect anger toward migrants visible, vulnerable, and lacking political power. This scapegoating dynamic is central to Trump's strategy. It allows him to tell a simple story. Your economic pain, your loss of status, your insecurity, these are caused by outsiders. It is a narrative of misdirection. It conceals the real drivers of inequality, financial deregulation, declining union power, corporate offshoring, tax cuts for the wealthy by locating blame at the border. There is also a profound historical irony. Mexican culture, cuisine, labor, language, and communities have been deeply woven into the American Southwest for centuries, long before large portions of that region were annexed by the United States. Yet in Trump's message, these communities are reimagined as foreign invaders. History is rewritten to serve a politics of exclusion. As I observe this dynamic, I see a nation wrestling not with immigration, but with its own identity. Trump's rhetoric exposes fears that have been simmering in American society for decades, fears of change, diversity, and the erosion of old hierarchies. In this sense, the immigration debate is not truly about borders, it is about belonging. Trump weaponizes that anxiety, and in doing so, he transforms the border from a policy challenge into an existential drama, one where reason is eclipsed by fear, and where the immigrant becomes a symbol for every unspoken fear about America's transformation. When I analyze Trump's immigration stance through a structural economic lens, it becomes clear that the border crisis narrative functions as a political diversion, a way to redirect public anger away from the true sources of economic distress in the United States. And these sources are not migrants. They are the profound transformations and imbalances within the American economic system itself. For decades, the United States has experienced rising inequality, stagnating wages, collapsing manufacturing towns, and a political economy increasingly dominated by corporate interests. These trends hollowed out communities long before migration from Mexico or Central America rose to national prominence. The wealthy captured the gains of growth, Wall Street financialized the economy, unions weakened, and entire regions were left behind. Yet instead of confronting these structural failures, Trump's narrative frames migrants as the perpetrators of economic decline, an intuitively appealing but empirically false accusation. Let me start with deindustrialization. Beginning in the late 1970 seconds and accelerating in the 1990 seconds and 2000s, U.S. corporations moved millions of jobs overseas to lower wage countries. Automation replaced many others. Communities that had depended on steel mills, auto plants, and textile factories lost their economic lifelines. The result was a deep sense of betrayal, of companies abandoning workers, and of policymakers failing to protect them. But rather than acknowledge this reality, political rhetoric increasingly turned toward blaming outsiders. Migrants became the face of economic anxiety, despite having little to do with plant closures or technological displacement. In fact, many Mexican migrants filled jobs that remained in the U.S. precisely because those industries could not automate or offshore them. Yet they were cast as the cause of wage stagnation, even though the primary forces undermining wages were corporate bargaining power, weakened labor protections, and lax antitrust enforcement. Financialization compounds the problem. Over time, American corporate strategy shifted from long-term investment toward short-term shareholder returns. Companies squeezed workers, cut benefits, and suppressed wages. But again, migrants were blamed for these pressures, creating a convenient political illusion that wage stagnation was the result of competition with immigrants rather than deliberate policy choices benefiting elites. The drug war adds another layer, U.S. Demand for narcotics fuels violence in Mexico and Central America, driving migration northward. But instead of addressing the underlying causes, poverty, corruption, failed development models, and U.S. Drug consumption, Trump weaponizes the symptoms. He uses migrants fleeing violence as proof of chaos at the border, even though the instability is partly an unintended consequence of U.S. policies. Scapegoating then performs a powerful political function. It transforms diffuse systemic failures into a single, visible enemy. It tells struggling Americans that the forces harming them are not corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms, but families crossing a desert. And it obscures the fact that immigration actually contributes to economic growth. From my perspective, Trump's border emergency does not confront America's real emergency: deep inequality, the erosion of the middle class, and a political system increasingly captured by wealth. Migrants become substitutes for accountability. The wall becomes a symbol of protection in a world where policymakers refuse to protect workers from the structures that have failed them. What Trump offers is not a solution, but a story, one that replaces structural analysis with emotional simplicity. And in that substitution lies the heart of America's immigration politics. As I step back from the tumult of Trump's rhetoric and the spectacle of a national emergency at the U.S.-Mexico border, I find myself asking a more fundamental question. What would a rational, humane, and economically grounded immigration policy actually look like? Because if we clear away the noise, the fear, and the political opportunism, we see that the United States problem is not immigration at all. It is the profound inability of its political system to address the structural inequalities and historical responsibilities that shape migration flows. In my analysis, a constructive approach begins with an acknowledgement of reality. Immigrants are not the cause of America's crises. They are central to its dynamism. The true challenge is inequality, deindustrialization, corporate power, climate vulnerability cannot be solved with walls or deportations. They require systemic reform. A humane policy, therefore, must start with legal pathways, not militarized barriers. The U.S. economy needs immigrant labor at nearly every skill level. A functioning immigration system would expand work visas, regularize the status of long-term residents, and create avenues for temporary and seasonal workers to move safely rather than risking their lives under the control of smugglers. This is not generosity, it is economic realism. Second, we must address the root causes of migration. Violence and economic insecurity in Mexico and Central America are not spontaneous. They are tied to decades of distorted development, U.S. driven market liberalization, failed drug policies, and climate shocks that devastate vulnerable communities. A rational foreign policy would prioritize regional development, targeted investment, and cooperative governance, not punitive sanctions or militarized border enforcement. Third, the United States must reclaim its tradition of integration rather than exclusion. When immigrants arrive, they must not be forced into the shadows. A modern immigration system would protect labor rights, prevent exploitation, ensure access to education and healthcare, and create pathways to citizenship. The moral and economic logic here is identical. Integrated migrants contribute fully. Marginalized migrants are trapped in precariousness that benefits no one except exploitative employers. Fourth, we must confront the mythology that Trump exploits. The notion that immigrants steal jobs or depress wages is politically powerful but factually incorrect. Wage stagnation stems from domestic policy choices, weakened unions, deregulated markets, and tax policies that reward concentration of wealth. Blaming migrants is an evasion, not an explanation. Finally, and most critically, the United States must recover a sense of moral self-understanding. The country's strength has always come from its openness, from its willingness to absorb and harness the aspirations of those who arrive at its borders. When Trump mobilizes fear against immigrants, he is not protecting America. He is undermining the very foundation that made it extraordinary. A rational immigration policy, then, is not only a moral necessity, it is an economic imperative and a democratic safeguard. It requires rejecting the politics of scapegoating and embracing a model of shared prosperity grounded in fact, compassion, and institutional responsibility. If America wishes to remain a great nation, it must once again believe in what made it great. The courage to welcome newcomers, the wisdom to confront structural failures honestly, and the humility to recognize that its future depends, as it always has, on those who come seeking hope.